All right, guys, so here we are. Welcome back. We are going to be focusing on chapter 4, which is activity-based costing. And so what I started in the last video was talking about just factory overhead and just different scenarios. But if we're going to be talking about product costs, we need to kind of take a trip down memory lane, right? So we're looking at when we have a product, we need three things to manufacture a product. And what we learned back in chapter 1 is we need direct materials, direct labor, and factory overhead. Now, as I mentioned before, your factory overhead is always that gray area because, which is this area because it includes all of those things that we don't really know how to it's not directly traced back to a product, right? So remember, factory overhead is untraceable. It includes all of the depreciation, the supervisor salary, maybe the salary of the janitorial staff. It includes your indirect materials and all of that good stuff. Depreciation, maybe I've mentioned that, property taxes, and utilities, right? So we have all of this in factory overhead. And now we must find a way to allocate all of those costs. So maybe we have a total of $3 million of factory overhead, right? And we have all of these different types of products. And now we need to decide how are we going to allocate all of this $3 million to each of the products or the items that we manufacture, right? So with that, if you guys remember back in chapter, oh my goodness, I feel like it's been a while. In chapter 2, we talked about the predetermined factory overhead rate. So hopefully maybe that makes sense to you, but if not, here's the formula on that targets the predetermined factory overhead. And we said the formula for it was the estimated total factory overhead cost for an entire year. So if I'm looking at this, maybe ours is $3 million. And then we would divide that by the estimated activity base. So maybe our activity base is going to be 300,000 hours, right? So in that sense, our predetermined overhead rate, our predetermined factory overhead rate given this information would be $10 per hour, right? And so if we had maybe a particular job that we're trying to allocate costs to, we would say, okay, this is the number of direct labor hours times this rate, and then that's how we would come up with the factory overhead that will be allocated to that job, right? So hopefully that kind of sort of makes sense, right? All right, so what I would say is this is the most common method, and we're going to talk about three different methods where we can allocate factory overhead. But this is, I want to say, is the most common. All right, so again, we're going to start with maybe this table and just expand from here. So what we're talking about at the current moment is factory overhead. Remember in the prior slide, I said we need three things to manufacture a product. We need direct labor, we need direct material, and then number 3, we need factory overhead. These two are less issues because we can clearly trace direct materials and direct labor to a product, right? Because when we have direct materials, we know exactly what's being tied to that particular product. And the same thing for labor. We know exactly what labor that's being, we know the labor that's being worked on, right? They have their timesheets. But factory overhead, again, is one of those gray areas where we have to figure out how much are we going to allocate to each of the products or each of the jobs. All right, so there's 3 different ways we can allocate factory overhead costs, and that's what you see in this table. So one of them, so here's our 3 options, and we're going to talk about each of these in detail. So the first one we're going to talk about is the single plant-wide. The first one we're going to talk about is the single plant-wide rate method. Remember, when we're looking at a product cost, we are not disputing direct materials, direct labor. The only thing we're focusing on is the factory overhead, okay? All right, so with that, let's go ahead and dive into the single plant-wide rate method. All right, so factory overhead is allocated to products using only one rate. Now, right now, that probably doesn't make much sense to you guys because right now that's all you know, right? So what I would say is the single plant-wide factory overhead rate is very, very similar to what we learned in chapter 2 when it came to the predetermined factory overhead rate, right? So this is our formula for it. So maybe take a picture of it, write it down. So every time we say the single plant-wide factory overhead rate, you're looking at the total budgeted factory overhead divided by the allocation base, okay? So as you can see, in comparison between the predetermined factory overhead rate, they look very, very similar to each other. And again, I mentioned before that it's a very common method, okay? And we'll talk about why it's common as well. All right, so just as a recap, an allocation base is also known as an activity driver. And so back in chapter 2, we talked about some common activity drivers were machine hours, direct labor hours, and direct labor cost. Okay, so let's go through this example and let's see if we can figure out what would be the single plant-wide factory overhead rate given this information. So it says, assume that Ruiz Company, which manufactures snowmobiles and riding mowers in a single factory, has a total budgeted factory overhead cost of $1.6 million and 20,000 total budgeted direct labor hours. So this is how, in this next step, this is how they're showing us they're computed, or how they have come up with how much we're gonna how we're gonna compute the number of hours. So they're saying that they're planning on making 1,000 snowmobiles for the year and 1,000 riding mowers. Each of them requires 10 hours per unit. So both of them added together, 10,000 plus 10,000, you need a total of 20,000 hours. All right, so now using our formula, we are now going to go into these steps and figuring out the single plant-wide factory overhead. So in our example, it told us that the total budgeted overhead was 1.6 million, and then divided by our total direct labor hours, which is 20,000 direct labor hours. And so as a result, our single plant-wide overhead rate is $80 per direct labor hour. So what does that mean in essence? Well, every time you have a job or you're trying to price a product, you're going to usually do the $80 times the number of direct labor hours required for that job. And that's how you'll come up with the total cost when in regards to just factory overhead, okay? So in our example, now once you come up with the single plant-wide factory overhead rate, you're going to now allocate that rate to each of your products to figure out what is your factory overhead cost per unit. So in the table below, you see for the snowmobile and the riding mower, the $80 represents the rate that we calculated, right? This represents this. And then in the prior slide, it told us that, the prior slide told us that each of the snowmobile and the riding mower requires 10 direct labor hours each. So therefore, if I did $80 times 10 direct labor hours, it will give me $800, okay? So that's just part of, this represents only a portion of the product cost. Remember, that only represents factory overhead. It does not include my direct labor or my direct material, okay? So hopefully that makes sense. So I would say take a second, go through this breakout session. I have included this in the demonstration as a handout. So go and check this out and see if you can work through this example without me telling you the answer, or clicking through the PowerPoint, and let's see if we can come up with the same numbers, okay? So take a break, pause the video, and then in the next video, I'll pick up where we left off.